Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening for you, depending on where you are. My name is Earle Charles, and I would like to welcome you to our Tech Talk program today. Our speaker is the very exciting Dr. Sharena Rice, and I'm so looking forward to hearing from her, as I'm sure you are as well. But before we get started, and we're going to go right into it pretty quickly because I know we do have some students among us today, and today is the first day of classes for the spring term, and we want them to hear as much as what they can hear from Dr. Rice, and then also catch their classes at 7 p.m. tonight. So we have a lot to do, and we'll do it right now. But in our midst is our Dean of the School of Management here, Dr. Gerhard Epfeld-Haller, and I would like him to, I hope I didn't mess that up too much, but I'd like him to say a few words to welcome you, and then we will proceed.
Well, thanks for the floor, Earle, and I'll keep it super short. I just wanted to make sure that I express how excited I am about today's speaker. I have known Sharena when she was still an undergraduate here at the university, and I hope she does remember. I certainly remember that we made an attempt at the School of Management to bridge the sciences with the business school by putting on an event that was called Molecules and Markets. The event terribly failed, but we attracted a few students out of that initiative who really got the idea that business and science and technology are not opposites, but they are complementary, and they are even fertilizing each other. And so I'm really happy that we have one of those amazing students from back then back with us after she has embarked on a fantastic career outside of Cal Lutheran. And let me just end by saying that I think this is a great testimony to what Cal Lutheran does, right? The Liberal Arts Foundation, the connection between different disciplines, that is something that differentiates us from many much larger research-focused institutions. So thank you, Dr. Charles. Thank you, Dr. Whitman, for putting this on, and Dr. Rice, kudos to you, and I give the floor back to you.
Thank you so much, Dean. So, and as we promised, we will not keep you away from Dr. Rice for too long, but as was just said by the Dean, Dr. Rice is known in Cal Lutheran and elsewhere, of course, and one of her mentors is Dr. Whitman, who was also my mentor. I'm sitting in his seat right now. He is on sabbatical, but he came back today to spend some time with us, and he especially wanted to introduce Dr. Rice. So Dr. Whitman, please.
Thank you, Dr. Charles. It is delightful for me to have this opportunity. I'll just very briefly tell you that I've known Dr. Rice since approximately the time she wrote that documentary. I am privileged to have a lovely niece who introduced me to many of her friends over the years, and many of them address me as Uncle Paul. So you may hear that from Dr. Rice. That is a title of affection between us, and she does amazing work. I have never had a conversation with Dr. Rice that I did not walk away saying, "Oh my land, what have I just learned?" And it's remarkable, and I look forward to everything she has to say. I've seen her artwork. I listened to her dissertation defense, where she described neuroscience in terms that the entire room full of people across the educational spectrum could understand. Absolutely remarkable. So I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say, Dr. Rice, and I will turn the ball over to you folks.
Dr. Rice, you are on. Thank you so much for joining us and presenting to us tonight.
Thank you. And now I shall share my screen. All right, the Google Fiber went down in my house, so I have relocated to a coffee shop. This fire extinguisher, it is not an emoji, it is real. But I guess this means that we can feel like we're in a coffee shop together. And even better, if anything combusts, then there is this fire extinguisher to take care of that. The integrations in this talk are philosophy, science, technology. 3 words, simple. One of the problems that I see with the world is that these tend to be treated as separate, and they tend to be prioritized differently in societal narratives we tell. Where technology is treated as if it's the most important, where it seems that everyone wants to hire a machine learning engineer, science seems next important. And then for philosophy, is being a philosopher even a job? And yet, at the same time, I think philosophy is the foundation of science, and science is the foundation of technology. Let's look into this further. In a way, this talk is an analysis of analysis itself. What is information technology if it is not actually making sense of the world around us? If it's taking correlation for causation? In these cases, it would be a process that barks up the wrong tree rather than something that leads to insights that can be used for decision making. Let's explore barking up the wrong tree. I like to frame problems in analytics as finding the very truthy truth. What does the very truthy truth even mean? It is collecting the signals that are needed to solve the problem at hand. But how do we know we are barking up the right tree? We live in a noisy world with tons of signals. Let's look to ants first. Although ants are tiny bugs with tiny brains, they're able to find their way from their nest to their source of food and back. A group of scientists, Dittlinger, Benner, and Wolf, wondered how ants navigate through the desert. And to study this, what they did was they made tall ants happen. They placed ants on stilts so that their legs were twice as long. But they found that when they put the ants in the desert, the ants did not just get to their food faster, they walked twice the distance to their food, which meant that they walked past the food. But similarly, when the group made short ants happen by cutting the ants' legs to half their original length, the ants walked half the distance to their food and back. And this led the group of scientists to conclude that ants probably navigate by counting their number of steps. Number of steps, it's a truthy truth that is good enough to allow most ants to survive in the desert, assuming that they don't get randomly put on stilts often. But what about other systems? Let's look at some examples in robotics. This robot navigates with whiskers. If a metal whisker hits the wall, that completes a circuit and then the robot pivots. The truthy truth here is that there are obstacles where they are, and this very truthy truth is collected by the whisker signal, telling the robot to navigate away from physical obstacles. Similarly, this is a robot that is afraid of the dark. And the very truthy truth for this robot is the light level, and it's picked up by these photoresistors. If I put my hand over it and block out the light, then the robot will pivot and continue moving. But what about the truthiest truths for more complex things, like analyzing human behavior? I've co-founded Intvo and served as chief scientific officer for 2.5 years. And what this company does is it uses computer vision for pedestrian behavior prediction. We had the challenge of making software that will analyze road scenes, similarly to how a highly attentive human driving would. And here are some of the very truthy truths we tried to look into: interactions, distraction, awareness, and these all have different things involved with them. So for example, is the person paying attention to their surroundings? Are they holding a phone? How far away are they from the vehicle? And we can take these factors and assign the pedestrian a level of risk. And those are shown by the white bars on the right sides of each of them. And with this, we can use these signals. Computer vision, it's always attentive, unlike humans. And then if a pedestrian is indeed considered at risk, then the system sends a warning signal to the driver. So then these solve problems in road safety picked up by software, and then it's relayed to the driver, where ultimately a human makes the decision. In the end, for a lot of things in autonomous vehicles, there are questions about who is responsible in the operations of the vehicles. Autonomous vehicles, they seem to have a long way to go to gain trust and to solve road safety issues. So then for our system, the human driver makes the decision, similar to how a human makes a decision to attend to or ignore the seatbelt signal in their cars. Now, I will take you through how I generally think about robotics problems. Robotics like a neuroscientist. The first question that we ask is, what is the situation? The second question, how does the nervous system handle this situation? And the third question is, how do we synthesize this to make something happen? One example that I have is that for one of our strategic partners at Intvo, they asked us to build a system to analyze information from 4 different cameras at once in real time. And we found that the computer, it could run this well on 3 cameras worth of data, but there was the question of how to make this work well for a 4-camera system. So then in my mind, I visualized how this would work if the car was an animal. Let's say that this is the car, and this is an obstacle. If the car is moving forward, it cannot hit anything or anyone behind it. But similarly, if the car was moving left, then it would be much less likely to hit anything on the right. Thus, if information about the car's direction could be taken into account with the computational weight given to the cameras accordingly, then this would allow our system to have the truthiest truth to solve that problem. I came up with that solution in about a minute, but I've been seeing more connections as well. Why is the nervous system good inspiration for technology? Part of the reason is it can be used to make technology more compatible with humans. Some people, they talk about humanizing technology or making human-centered designs, but I think building technology with a situational understanding in mind, not just the human, but the human in their context. That allows us to think about the truthiest truths to solve the problem. And that ultimately leads to technology that helps more kinds of people in more kinds of scenarios. For example, about 10% of people have alexithymia, hardships identifying emotions, whether their own emotions or the emotions of other people. There is a question of what is the root of alexithymia? And my hypothesis is that it is a mind-body problem. Every emotion has corresponding bodily sensations. For example, if you're exuberant, then you might feel physically lighter and floatier. But if you're tired, you will feel more heavy, even though your actual weight has not changed at all. And that's part of why feelings are called feelings. I advise a startup that makes technology for feelings. And this is called Valence Vibrations. It was co-founded by Chloe Duckworth and Shannon Brownlee at USC. Their technology, it takes emotions from tone of voice, it transmits the emotions as haptics on a wristband, and this can help people understand each other's emotions or even their own emotions better in real time. And then the vibrations themselves, they express emotions emotionally, where anger is felt as a pulse and happiness feels more light and tingly. Some people have alexithymia all the time, but everyone has alexithymia sometimes. So there can be situationally induced alexithymia of misunderstanding others, whether that's because of cultural misunderstandings or personalities or neurotypes, because there's variation in how different people's brains process information. Creating an emotional passport to help people navigate across differences could solve lots of problems in human interaction. And now that I've described some integrated technologies, I've drawn a picture of how I visualize the system of technology, science, and philosophy. This is how I conceptualize the system. Let's consider this with culture. Culture determines which questions we ask in the first place when approaching anything else. And in this, we have technology. The special thing about technology is that if it's new, then it might be protectable by utility patents. But while you can patent a process that uses science, you cannot patent science itself. We also have what is called deep technology, or deep tech, technology that can't really be hacked together while expected to work. It needs to be thought out. For example, there are advances in medicine which take a lot of research and development and testing to do in order to gain trust or approval. And then there's science. Science is how things work, and it's based on evidence, whether it's social science or it's natural sciences. There's theoretical science, which involves building models based on observations from science. And then there's philosophy, the love of wisdom. Philosophy is the underpinning search for truth. Science is the methods of finding how the universe works in a repeatable way. And there is technology, the execution of things. It's notable that philosophy tends to be theoretical, while technology tends to be applied and practical. And then there comes the questions that these different things seem to emphasize. Science seems to emphasize the question, what is this? Whereas technology tends to emphasize, what do we do? And philosophy tends to emphasize this huge why of why are we doing this? And although I put this system together neatly here, the dots only seem to connect while looking backwards. I showed a bit about how I think and what I've been into, but now it's time to connect the dots going backwards, the how and the why. Why did I become a neuroscientist? Well, part of the reason why is because I majored in biochemistry, and then I minored in philosophy and psychology out of interest. And although I seemed to feel pulled in 3 different directions at the same time, I concluded that there was a common element amongst the 3 of these things, and that was thought itself. And I thought that I could combine the disciplines by becoming a neuroscientist so that I could just collect them all. And then there's the question of, why did I become an entrepreneur? With that, there is a tale of 2 grandfathers. Both of my grandfathers came from humble means. Both of them were entrepreneurs. They both became extremely successful by the standards of their cultures, and both of them eventually lost their fortunes in very different ways. My father's father started various businesses and did well in them. He was good with making people happy and good with machines, and he had a vending machine business. He bought an airplane, retired, used his money to enjoy life, but he did not support my father's decision to go to college. My mother's father was orphaned when he was only about 10 years old, and he was hardworking and generous. He started a business as a contractor and donated to his temple, the supporting bedrock of the community. He was civically engaged and gave loans to businesses that were in hard times, even though his country did not really have a legal structure. A lot of these things were based on handshakes and a person's honor. But if he couldn't hire a person himself, he would help them find jobs. And when people were trying to escape from areas of war, he sent them gold. But when my mother was 12 years old, my grandfather was killed by a drunk driver. Later, the communists came and they took away everything. My mother's family left. They were refugees for a time, but eventually they made it to the US because someone whom my grandfather knew from long ago got to the US and put together a sponsorship. Could anyone have predicted this series of events? But there's a bigger picture here that comes full circle. I grew up listening to stories about my two grandfathers, and I wanted to be like my mother's father, who created a level of wealth that extended just really far beyond himself. This is a big reason why I said yes when I was eventually asked to be Intvo's co-founder. What if I could take things that make me sad or angry and just invert this to solve a problem? What if I could prevent someone from being hit by a car? What if I could save a life? But I also need to note that I was an entrepreneur for years before becoming an entrepreneur, partly by showing up. I did the groundwork of showing up and learning. I attended many entrepreneurship-related events via the School of Management when I was an undergrad at Cal Lutheran. And although I was probably a bit of a flounder at first, I learned to think a lot more like an entrepreneur over time. The great thing about Cal Lutheran is that even though I never actually took a business course, and I did not actually start a company until years after I graduated, I was able to find venues and support even to make some entrepreneurship events and workshops happen. Thus, I would encourage people to show up to events that they're interested in, because you never know. Relationships can help a lot in navigating a complex world, a world that constantly changes. Now there's the question of, how did I become a cybernetician? I guess that the answer is because I'm also like my father's father, good at solving problems with living systems and machines. No, I don't have a vending machine company, but I do, but I did help make this thing happen, or rather I did a lot of debugging for the setup when I was a grad student. This is a setup for mouse virtual reality in my dissertation lab. So then we had this spherical treadmill that a mouse could run on, and then there was this computer screen where there would be an advancement of a virtual maze on the screen, and we could measure brain signals at the same time that this mouse was running through a virtual maze. And I liked troubleshooting the electrical components, the pneumatics, and how this all worked in the context of behavior. And then there are the amusing robots like this one, because I have to show some of the shenanigans. This is like a magic 8 ball, except I programmed it with 64 different sassy responses. You ask it a question, you give it a shake, and it gives a sassy response. Let's see some of these. It says that you're crazy, it gave a side eye, and then it said, yo mama. I'm feeling so fly like a G6. All right. And then why did I become a storyteller? The reason why for that is because nothing seems to really matter unless there is a story or a context with it. People will not remember the numbers when presented with numbers, but being able to translate stories to numbers and numbers to stories is the making and finding of meaning. Stories are generally how we make sense of the world and its situations. So then, who do I want to be? The answer is that although every job helps people, what is the truthiest truth of my work towards this goal of inverting as much suffering as possible in this lifetime? There are many signals in life, and I think I figured out a few things. I would like to be at the intersection of artificial intelligence, natural intelligence, health, and wellness. It's quite a gray area, and it's a good place for a neuroscientist to be. And also at the center of humans, machines, and narratives, because these integrations are a rewarding challenge that do take the ability to think on multiple levels at once. And yet, no field and no person is necessarily static. Things change. This is another one of my inventions. And yes, the puns about vents are intended here. This is what I like to call a Venn diagram. And it's pretty much like a Venn diagram, except that it has vents to it. And moving from one part to another, that could be considered an event. And this is even more accurate because people often don't fit into just one box, even if they seem to on the surface. And a lot of situations of change, they do flow from one thing to another in some kind of way. It's an evolutionary process. Furthermore, when it comes to combining disciplines, I like to do this thing that I term shuffle synthesis. And this is how shuffle synthesis works. Read two books antithetical to each other. An example that I like to use is Ayn Rand and Karl Marx because they completely disagree with each other on lots of things. So then with that, read one chapter from one book, read one chapter from another book, and then repeat this process. And through doing that, then you can gain some perspective. This is kind of like Hegel's dialectical method. There's a thesis, an antithesis, and then there is a synthesis. And that is how progress happens. And you can do something similar to make sense of the world by building the framework to your lifestyle. I felt that my lifestyle itself was a shuffle synthesis when I was at grad school living in a temple and being an entrepreneur. Ideas from each would cross-pollinate to the others, and this is partly because each emphasized a different point of progress. What the temple did was it emphasized growth as a person. Before I lived there, I used to think the saying, words fall short, was a matter of intellectual laziness, because of course, if you're a good communicator, then you would be able to express everything in words. But I learned over time that there are things that cannot be understood on an intellectual level, but they need to penetrate to an intuitive level to make a difference, especially when it comes to working with matters of the mind and body. The lab emphasized growth as a scientific researcher, matters of detail orientation to uncover fundamental problems of how the brain processes information. And then startups, they emphasized growth in terms of bringing innovations into the world so that people could benefit from them. Going between these different mindsets and integrating them gave a much larger perspective on how to see situations from multiple different angles at the same time, even if I am only one person. The world needs better integration to solve its problems. And now, a question for all of you to consider and revisit regularly. Which dots will you connect? And speaking of connecting dots, it's time for questions and discussion.
Well, first, I'll say quite amazing. And I see one of our students, Arsene, has a question. Please unmute yourself and ask your question, Arsene.
Hi, Sharena. Thank you so much for a great lecture. Very interesting and motivating. My question is actually about the intersection of the circles of your interests and what do you think this area is going to be in the future? Thank you.
I'm still extremely intrigued by thought in general. And so there's the question of what does create thought. Part of it is going to be, how can humans solve problems the best? How can machines solve problems the best? And how can they come together to solve problems really the best? And so those things are the most interesting to me. And also collecting interests and compiling them, well, kind of into funnels of what seems to be the right problem at this point in history. That is part of the essence of figuring out the current time and where the puck is going in the future.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you. I see Mickey Da Silva has a question for you, Dr. Rice. Mickey, unmute yourself, please.
Howdy, Dr. Rice.
Greetings, Mickey.
I wanted to ask. Forgive me, I'm not a neurologist. I'm not a neuroscientist, but I've heard of this study that says that using an fMRI, we're able to detect an action before someone is aware that they're going to take an action. You know, some milliseconds before someone is quote unquote aware that they're going to take the action. Again, I'm not terribly familiar with the neuroscience behind it. And I was wondering, with your VR rat setup, were you guys able to detect anything similar to that?
Yes. One system that we wanted to create in our lab was a closed loop system where we'd measure from the motor cortex, and then as the mouse creates more activity of its motor cortex, then it would advance through the virtual maze. We didn't actually make that happen, but at least in theory, it could happen.
Okay.
As for readouts of neural information, that's pretty much how prosthetics work. We take neural signals and then we're able to translate that to motions. And that is one of the big problems or solutions in that area, decoding neural activity.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So we're open for other questions from anyone else. Of course, Dr. Rice is here and willing to answer them.
I have a question from an audience member that I'll read. You are all welcome to type any questions that you have in the chat or use the hand raise function to request to unmute yourself. The question that we have on the topic of autonomous vehicles, you mentioned the need to build trust. Part of that involves beta tests with consumers, as some car makers are doing, but that puts all of society, other drivers, first responders, etc., into a risk model that they didn't choose or agree to. Do you see a potential solution to help resolve this conundrum?
Yeah, I think that a big part of it is that ultimately there needs to be a human in charge for there to be a sense of responsibility. So then if a person accidentally hits another person with their car, then they may feel guilty for a long time about it. But if it was just a vehicle, will that vehicle feel guilt about that? Well, and then there's the question of who is responsible. So is it the company that made the vehicle? Is it the company that made the software? So ultimately, I think that it's going to take a long time for autonomous vehicles to really be trusted, and that if we keep humans in charge, but we help them have a signal for if there is a pedestrian danger, then that kind of bridges that gap between now safer road and just people not having their hands off of the wheel and not driving at all. But there are different levels of autonomy where we can have some autonomy where a person receives some signals. There are higher levels of autonomy where a person could generally not be paying attention, but they may choose which direction the car is going. And then there's fully autonomous, where a person could be completely asleep at the wheel and transported as if they are on a magic carpet with wheels. So I think that it needs to be built up over time as a kind of gradient.
Interesting. I would certainly love one of those magic carpets, but it seems the point that we're at now is more that the technology, at least for cars, can enhance the human decision making, but we're not ready for it to replace it. Would you agree with that?
Yep.
Okay, any additional questions?
And you can ask anything. I'm a pretty friendly human.
Okay, we have a couple more questions here. This one says, I have a question less directly about neuroscience and robotics. I wanted to ask Dr. Rice, why Dr. Rice decided to take up residence at a Zen Buddhist temple.
It's kind of funny. When I was in high school, I wrote in my journal, one day I would like to live in a Buddhist temple. And then eventually I go to grad school, and it turns out that there is a Buddhist temple that is a 4-minute bike ride away from my laboratory. So of course I have to go and check it out. So I go to the temple, and it's good. And then I go, wow, this is fantastic. I need to go back again, because I felt just really grateful for days afterwards. So then I came back again and again and again and again. And eventually a priest suggested that I apply to be a resident because I'd be a good fit. So I said yes. And well, I don't know if there's going to be a time when I could just do that again. But it was there, and it seems almost as if it was manifested somehow. But that temple has existed in Ann Arbor for about 40 years.
Very interesting. Some additional questions that we have. What are the big picture risks of AI in your view?
I think that AI, a lot of it is reflective of human values in terms of at least its initial constructs. There comes questions of, okay, are human values actually helpful to humanity? Are they helpful to the larger situation? And if so, in which ways? And whose interests, given the wide array of humans that there are? So I think of the big risk as, okay, the claw problem. This is a problem where we solve the problem at one angle, this problem, but actually in solving this problem, this actually kicks the larger problem down the road as something to deal with later. And this seems to be a prevalent problem in the world of technology in general, where they may be a bandage for now, but they don't actually, let's say, solve a broken bone. And so I think that it helps to have explainable technology. Some artificial intelligence has gotten to the point where it's starting to create itself in ways that we can't explain. And if we can't explain it, but it's something that is created and it does make decisions, then what does that really mean? But then again, what kinds of insights can this create that our short-sightedness may not be able to see itself?
That leads really well into a follow-up question, and then we'll have Russell ask his question. So that question was about the risks of AI. What, in your view, are the great opportunities to invert human suffering, more generally, the suffering of humans, animals, and the world?
I think that one of the big potentials for artificial intelligence is, okay, well, firstly, if it's created in a way that helps us, let's say, keep the human species alive for as long as possible, while also taking many things into account, that it can lead to better decisions being made. There's the question of, are people actually going to pay attention to those decisions that an AI would make if it does incorporate all of these different backgrounds at once? Or are they going to ignore this because, hey, it's not good enough for my country, for instance? So I think that there is a big opportunity for it to do multifactorial analysis, but also to analyze from different dimensions and different perspectives at once.
Okay. I see Dr.
My turn.
Stockert has a few points to make, and then we'll go to Mickey after that.
Well,
Please.
I hope Dr. Rice will actually make the points, but thank you, Earle. Appreciate it. Yes, I've enjoyed your talk and your responses to our questions immensely, Dr. Rice. Um, I also did not know that there was a Zen Temple, I guess, in Ann Arbor. My wife went to the University of Michigan and worked there for a number of years after she got her doctorate. So I'll be checking with her after I get home uh, to see if she ever stopped by there. At any rate, well, the AI question uh, that just came just previously um, is one I want to kind of follow up on, and my particular uh, take on it has to do with, I guess, uh, ethical questions. You know, the early questions around robots had to do with their not doing any harm to humans. And there's a documentary. I think it was made in Germany about robots actually doing harm to people. And of course, then we have the issue of the autonomous cars and all that. And you kind of began to address some of those issues. So, can we think about? I mean, there's also the issue with artificial intelligence about what kind of inputs you put in there, and then you have problems, for example, with facial recognition and not being able to recognize people of color and that kind of thing. But so that gets me to the larger issue, which is the ethics. So maybe we should be um, prioritizing ethical issues and issues that have to do with diversity, equity, inclusion, sustainability, climate justice, and those kinds of things. And those we should be building those in every step of the way as we try to get the machines to do relatively simpler tasks. So, have you done much thinking about that? And this ties in, of course, with the question about alleviating human suffering, animal suffering, I suppose, too. Your philosophy.
Yeah, I've thought
You can handle it.
I've thought a lot about
Right.
these things. Well, one thing that I think about artificial intelligence is what if it was made kind of like how medicine is made? Medicine, it's highly regulated. It needs to undergo tons of standards and rigorous testings in order to get to market. Whereas a lot of things in artificial intelligence, they may be put together and then just go out to market relatively quickly, partly because they aren't regulated like medicine is. But in a way, everything could be considered medicine because it's considered a solution to some sort of ill or ailment. There could be overdose of the medicine that is artificial intelligence in some ways. There are side effects of medicine and there are interactive effects of medicine. And then there's the issue of, is the medicine tested on all kinds of people or just one kind of person? And so I think that issue in terms of thinking about it as medicine is a different angle than most people would take, but I come from a biomedical science background, so that's how I tend to think of these problems myself.
Well, great. I think that's a good framework, and obviously we need to pursue that. Obviously we've seen the success of the COVID-19 vaccines and boosters and that kind of thing, and that technology is available to deal with diseases like malaria and so on. So I think that's a great way to approach it, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Russell.
Mm-hmm.
Or thank you, Dr. Stockard.
Either way, it's fine. Thank you.
Daddy, I think we'll go to Mickey next. Mickey De Silva. Follow-up question.
Hi again. Yes. I liked how you tied things together with your sitting. And when I was taught to sit, I was taught, follow your breath as a way to not be distracted by thoughts and to really try to be present in a moment, feel what's going on around you and in you. And I wonder, with artificial intelligence and how there are situations where we don't understand what it's doing or how it's doing it. At what point, in your opinion, is this program as sentient as you and me when we sit?
Yeah, when it comes to humans and machines, there comes the question of what makes a human human. and what makes a machine, and what makes consciousness, consciousness. And all of these things, they're rather fuzzy questions. So then if my robot, for example, had some sorts of tactile sensors to them, mechano sensors, then is it actually feeling if I'm smashing it with a hammer if it's not alive? And then there's the question of, how do we know that something truly is alive? I think that part of what makes humans humans is having the form of a human, being alive, and also, yeah, it is having the human form really too. As for sentience of robots, as much as I like talking with Siri sometimes, I get a sense that there is very much a limit to how broad the scope of this artificial intelligence's thinking is. And I think that this sense of awareness and ability to reflect upon itself, that's part of what sentience is, being able to have that reflective mechanism as not just a if-then statement, kind of like a loop structure in an algorithm, but as something that is prone to taking in more in a situation.
Well, I would love to have this conversation with you if you are in town for any period of time.
Thanks, Mickey. Hello, Daniel.
Hi, Dr. Rice. I just had a quick question for you. So my question for you is, when the artificial intelligence does become more advanced, do you think it has a potential to be smarter than the human brain? And I know that nothing is really smarter than the human brain because us humans are so advanced, but do you think it has that potential?
Well, there's the question of what is considered smarter. I think of intelligence in terms of, is this taking in the truthiest truth to solve the problem at hand? In which case, my computer is much smarter than me at a lot of things because I can't do as many computations nearly as fast. But at the same time, the way that I rotate things in my mind in terms of running visual simulations in imagination, I don't have to code that into a computer in order to have that intuition. And also, we're so smart when it comes to things like playing catch even. I mean, think about how many things would have to be programmed in terms of physics in a metaverse, for instance, to get that to happen well. So I think that it really depends on what is considered smart. It depends on what problem you're trying to solve. And I think that especially when it comes to more complex problems in terms of how we figure out how to hold ourselves, how to interact with people really, how to be good leaders, how to make sense of things, how to make good decisions, there is very much a need for the human elements of creativity, but also that sense of humanity in a way that's not just a simple set of inputs and outputs. That is what makes us really smart, being able to put together stories, and you can tell good stories probably much better than a computer would think to do.
Thank you.
Excellent. Are there any other questions online, Diane? Oh, here we are.
John has asked, what are my thoughts on the singularity as it relates to AI? My thought is, okay, the singularity is the idea that AI, what if AI could create an intelligence that is slightly smarter than it, and that intelligence could create an intelligence that is slightly smarter than it. And then it continues on and on until we get an artificial intelligence that is just so intelligent, yet it keeps evolving and getting smarter. I think that that could be quite the runaway strand. And a part of me wants to see it developed in a sandbox before it becomes something that is loose upon the world. But then again, it may trick us into something or another. There are existential risks involved. I suggest reading Nick Bostrom's book, Super Intelligence, as a further exploration.
Great.
Hello, Arsini. Am I pronouncing your name correctly?
No worries. Dr. Rice, thank you for your answers. Another question that you probably been already working for, but for some reason haven't talked in your presentation is brain-computer interface. So what do you think, where's it going, and how does AI gonna play into that?
I've talked with a lot of people in brain-machine interfaces, and I think that generally the way that it seems to be thought about is, okay, let's measure from people's brains and see how brain activity correlates with different behaviors. Let's try to read minds. And my thought about that is generally, if we're trying to read minds, then why not try to think about this almost as a magician would? For example, a mentalist who seems to be reading minds, even though they're not actually reading brain activity at all. So, well, a lot of brain-machine interface companies, they're trying to create hardware that gives a readout of neural signals. There's the question of how is this actually making sense of the world, and how is that actually going to be used? I think that both human behavior and neural signals, they need to be linked together really well in order to gain true insights, especially when it comes to individual differences of people and how they perceive things, especially when it comes to matters of determining how people process things to make any useful insights from it. It is cool that things are happening where there are ways to navigate drones using brain activity nowadays. And there are ways to look at how music affects the brain. But it's a part of me thinks that this should be further along by now, and maybe I can help make it further along.
Definitely should. Thank you for your answer
Absolutely.
and for the lecture.
Thanks, Arsene. We have a question, or at least the hand is raised for Christopher Newmark. Christopher, unmute yourself, please.
Hi, this is actually Sydney using Christopher Newmark's account.
Wow, AI.
I was wondering what your kind of broad thoughts were on AI in social media, because it seems that AI in social media is being used for more unethical things rather than ethical, very much for profit gain. So I was wondering kind of what your thoughts were on that with all of your tie-ins with philosophy and technology and also science.
Yeah, artificial intelligence, when it comes to social media, it seems to do things like have recommendations and choose different things in the feed on a social media, depending on what your preferences are, things like scroll speed, and trying to maximize engagement so that a company could gain more profits. At the same time, there is the question of, wait, but isn't that what the user wants? Because they are engaging with these things. And I think part of it will have to do with human awareness and how they think through their own activities with how they work with engagements in social media. Is this actually leading to them thriving, or is this making them feel sad because they're seeing all of their friends' accomplishments and going, wow, I've done like nothing with my life. Even I look at myself sometimes and go, am I actually doing anything with my life? And then the answer is, well, yes, I am. But sometimes it seems that there's constantly people who are happy on social media because that's all that they show. So for that, I think that it does take a human intelligence to take a step back to go, is this actually giving me the truthiest truth to solve my problems? And then, well, do we say, oh, it's all because of that company that I'm sad because their social media is so engaging and for some reason my brain loves it? I think that we also have to take responsibility as actors in the world.
Yes, agreed. Agreed.
Thanks, Sharena. That was a great answer. I hadn't thought about it like that before.
Thank you, Sydney. And then I have a question from Arvind. What are my thoughts on AI in healthcare? Will people trust AI versus humans to diagnose? My thought about AI in healthcare is that generally it seems to be a thing that's very much wished for, but I think that a lot of people tend to bark up the wrong tree with it. So for example, there's Google Health and there's IBM Watson, and they thought, okay, if we take in tons of data and train on a humongous, ginormous data set, then we'll be able to solve lots and lots of diseases. But guess what? IBM is offloading Watson and Google Health has become smaller. So then there's the question of, okay, they may have curated these data sets to some extent, but are they doing this in a way that is actually going to solve problems? And I think that people will trust AI versus a human to diagnose if it is a human working with an AI more than if it's just one or just the other, partly because each gives a level of insight that the other doesn't. Is an AI going to take just one point, for example, one picture into account, whereas a human is looking at the whole patient and that patient's story and various things in their background, such as their hobbies? Because we are all, as Oliver Sacks said, a combination of biology and biography. And this does need to be taken into account to really solve the problems of patients. They can't just be treated as if they are tissues in a test tube.
And if I might just add a little to that, I fully agree with your response, by the way, because I've worked in healthcare for quite some time as well. The goal with AI, at least when at the hospital where I worked, was for AI to make recommendations about diagnoses and so on, present it to the physician or the provider, and then they, as you just said, they will take that holistic view and then proceed on how to treat the patient beyond that point. So I'm with you on that. The healthcare professional says, thank you for that beautiful answer, Dr. Rice. She was speaking to you, not me.
Thanks. Thank you for being a healthcare professional.
Absolutely. Wonderful. So Diana, where are we with regards to time, my dear friend?
Well, this is just about the end of the time we have allotted. Dr. Rice, would you like to make any final comments before we say our thank yous?
Sure. One thing that I would say is, in a world that has a lot of liminality and lots of fleetingness, and where a lot of things may seem to be in chaos, stay enchanted.
Love
because
that.
Perhaps the best is yet to come.
Yes. Agreed. Well, this has been an amazing hour. It went by way too fast. And but I would like to extend our gratitude to you, Dr. Rice, for everything that you shared with us and your time and your research and all of the work that you're doing. I don't know how you do it. It's amazing. So thank you once again for giving us sharing your wisdom with us. And we look forward to reading about you and hearing about you as you go forward. And it's wonderful that you started here at Cal Lu. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Absolutely. Thanks again.